Happy New Year, ladies and gentlemen. This is an occasion which we want to celebrate, not just the new year, the upcoming new year of the horse in the Chinese community. We are here to celebrate the start of Christian Borgemeister. And in that context, I welcome you all. There will be substantive welcoming remarks from 4 distinguished speakers. I welcome you on behalf of ZEF-Directors. Solveig and I have invited you. Solveig is sitting first row here too. And I'm pleased that the invitation was responded to so favorably. Let me briefly remind you that ZEF started its existence almost 20 years ago, in a year or a year and a half, however we count it. Yeah? Mid-1990s. Uwe Holz and Professor Bonet will remember. So welcome especially to founding fathers and mothers of ZEF who are here today. What happened since then? The world did not only add about 1.5 billion people to its existence, further stressing the planet, but the world transformed in many ways, and that was and is a continuous challenge for our institute. ZEF has an agenda which is changing. I think the recipe for a successful Center for Development Research here in Bonn has 7 ingredients, not less than that. I mean, skilled chefs cooking dishes say not more than 3 tastes on a plate. I'm afraid a successful Center for Development Research cannot just work with 3. My 7 are, number 1, interdisciplinarity, truly reaching far between and across social science and natural science. And that's where you, Christian, will be a cornerstone. There are very few development think tanks and research centers who fully embrace and are partly driven by natural science and ecology. Secondly, sound academic in the disciplines, sound academia, research quality in the disciplines which we have here. Third, relevance for development issues. Fourth, evidence-based policy advice and think tank. 5, a dynamic turnover of young researchers, our doctoral students, coming and going but staying in touch as part of our growing network. More than 500 by now, all over the world. 6, lasting partnership with institutions around the world. 7, capacity building and capacity strengthening in science with our partners together. I think those are the ingredients of success of this institute, who are stable, but the content changes all the time. So our science agenda is changing, and the way we operate is changing. And Christian, you and your background is coming in very handy to all of these 7 ingredients to bring innovation to ZEF. You will be introduced later on by speaker number 4, our board chair. Without further ado, I would like to ask now Professor Armin Kramer, the Pro-Rector, so the Deputy Vice Chancellor of University of Bonn, for Planning and Finance, to step up here and say welcoming remarks from the side of University of Bonn. Please.
Dear Professor Borgemeister, dear fellow directors, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to bring to this inaugural lecture of Professor Borgemeister the greetings and best wishes of the Rectorate of the University of Bonn. You have mentioned parts of the history. Among the honored guests, I'm particularly glad to greet Dr. Frank Speyer, previously with our ministry in Düsseldorf, who in the founding years, 95 and before 95 even, had advised and guided the major initiatives in connection with the science part of the Bonn-Berlin law. So as such, the establishment of ZEF in 95, give or take a little, until the research really began, it became 1997. ZEF was closely connected with the goal, the then goal and now goal, of strengthening the former capital, German capital of Bonn, as a science city and consolidating its role as an internationally acknowledged and welcome center for scientific research and development cooperation. So we at the Bonn University Rectorate are very glad about the evolution that ZEF has taken over the years. In particular, we very much appreciate what has been mentioned by Professor von Braun, the academic quality, the, you may say, continuing scientific underpinnings of, over the years, strongly increasing, of development research that have happened here at ZEF. And I think the following welcoming addresses, and of course Professor Borgemeister himself in his lecture, I'm very sure, will attest to both proof and promise of that statement. Having accompanied the directorship C, so I just count to 3, ABC, directorship C, search and recruitment process on behalf of the rectorate, I may add that Professor Borgemeister indeed had turned out, so much from this confidential procedure may be known to all, had turned out our prime choice of person with whom to expect ZEF to continue to blossom and grow. So we found that you, Professor Borgemeister, you have the type of background mentioned before by Professor von Braun that will further strengthen ZEF in its multidisciplinary endeavors of research, endeavors that cut across the faculties of Bonn University and beyond. So welcome to Bonn University in Swahili, Nakaribishwa Sanahapa.
Right. Well, that is testament to lots of languages being spoken at ZEF. It occurs to me we never counted them. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, ZEF depends on the close collaboration in research with the faculties of University of Bonn. And I'm very pleased that members from various faculties are here. The mathematical and natural science faculty I've seen. And, we couldn't and wouldn't ask them all to stand up and speak. I'm particularly pleased that the Dean, Professor Stehle of the Agricultural Faculty is here to say a welcoming remark because the relationships of Christian Borgemeister to the agricultural faculty will be particularly close. Dean Stehle, please address.
Thank you. Yeah. Dear Professor Borgemeister, dear Professor von Braun, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the agriculture faculty and indeed personally, I would like to welcome you, Professor Borgemeister, here in Bonn, in the nice Rhineland area. It looks not so nice today, but it can be. And wish you all the best for your new position. The active, longer than 2 years, means in the meantime traditional cooperation between the Center of Development Research and our faculty started early after foundation of the ZEF. You mentioned 1900 and yes, about 97 or 96. The colleagues responsible at that time recognized that the central topics of our both academic institutions can be successfully at least linked virtually to strengthen the research power in the region of Bonn in the important field of sustainable human development. Members of the so-called Triple Directorate are co-opted in our faculty and thus can officially communicate in regular commissions, which is very important. Colleagues of ZEF take over teaching activities in our faculty. For example, they are integrated in the Masters of Science program, Agriculture Sciences and Resource Management in the Tropics and Subtropics, in brief, arts. On a yearly basis, scientific workshops are organized for international students to exchange recent research results. Participants of ZEF doctoral study program are fully accepted and then recognized as PhD fellows in several departments of our faculty. For example, in 2013, 5 young researchers coming to Bonn from various regions in Africa and Asia successfully finished their doctoral thesis and received the Dr. Ager degree here in our faculty. Within the last 10 years, 3 scientists from ZEF, named Dr. Stefanie Engel, Dr. Peter Molinga, Dr. Christine Fürst, were qualified in our faculty as lecturer. In German we call that Habilitation. Several common research projects have been initiated and successfully performed during the years. Only 2 examples: conservation and use of wild populations of Cafe Arabica in the mountain rainforest of Ethiopia, and quite recently a project, the Globe E project, Matthias Becker is here, wetlands East Africa, reconciling future food production with environmental protection. So you learn it's a close cooperation between these 2 institutions in research and also in teaching. Tomorrow, Professor Borgemeister will give us the honor to present his research and teaching activities and future research goals in front of the faculty, in front of the Fakultätsrat, to initiate future collaborations. I'm sure, Herr Borgemeister, that your experience and knowledge in fields like food security, agriculture and health will interest a lot of colleagues to seek for cooperation, and thus will result in new common projects. The integration of our faculty in the One Health project idea is hopefully only an important focal point for future activities. Thank you very much and a lot of success. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Stehle. I see 2 people standing there. The 2 chairs are here for you. Or there. And there. But not many more. Christian Borgemeister didn't come alone to Bonn. He came in the company of his dear wife, Juliana. Juliana, welcome. Thank you that you brought him here. And enjoy your stay, you and your family, in Bonn. I welcome members of City of Bonn. I've seen Mrs. Hohen-Berghauen. I welcome members of ministries. Unfortunately, Mr. Wilfried Kraus had to cancel his appearance here on short notice. You know that currently government is being formed and responsibilities are being revisited, and he is very busy, and we should certainly understand that. He wanted to come, BMBF, BMZ, Agriculture Ministry, Environmental Ministry, I see members from it over there, are all great partners, as is the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. I may have forgotten other key donors, such as German Academic Exchange Service, who is essential for managing, for facilitating to manage ZEF's doctoral studies program. I see colleagues from the non-governmental organizations, Mr. Jahrmann from Deutsche Welthungerhilfe. Forgive me if I don't go through the rows. It's a distinguished audience, Christian. You may get to know them over the years. You can be proud that they all came out to listen to you. Jakob Rhyner is the UNU Vice Rector here in Bonn, and we have a very close relationship with United Nations University. Jakob Rhyner is also a member of the collective of the senior management team, the directors of ZEF. We do things together. We don't just talk, but we research together. Jakob, you have the floor.
Dear Professor Borgemeister, dear Christian, dear Joachim, dear colleagues. When I was some days ago thinking about what I would say here, I had the ZEF news with me. And I always read it very carefully. It's just the tip of the iceberg of my close relation, or our close relation to ZEF. In one of the parts towards the end of the ZEF news of November, in the Viewpoint, there was an interview with you, Christian, where you were questioned about the notion of interdisciplinarity. It has already been mentioned as a very important part of all our research. However, you said it sounds easy, but it is very difficult. And somewhere down the interview, you also said that it is interesting, but sometimes extremely frustrating. And I found it amusing, but I also found it relieving, because having spent my half of my own life, not my whole life, but half of my own life on the bridges between sciences and engineering, sciences and the so-called practice, I made this experience all the time. And I would like to take your statement even a bit further, saying that if it hasn't been frustrating at times, it has probably not been interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. Now, thinking about disciplines, I think ZEF and my institute, or our institute, UNU-EHS, are working on quite different disciplines. I think, Christian, you're going to research, among others, on the interlinkage between agriculture and health, while we're concentrating on environmental risk more from the side of natural hazards. However, having these different disciplines, I think we are interlinked by a very different, but by a very same and identical common goal, namely the focus on development. I think the focus on development is what really brings us together, and I don't think it will be sufficient for us in the next years, reminding what Joachim von Braun has said, that we are changing agendas and adapting agendas. It will not be sufficient just to come together under a common umbrella of development, but I think we also have to think about the notion of development itself. As far as I see, during my 2 years since I'm here, we are still thinking about development as being something for the so-called developing countries, which a bit unprecisely maybe, but still essentially means poor countries. I don't think this will be the notion with which we can address the future. I think we have to think about in a more global sense. Of course, looking at development as helping some of the countries to escape the poverty trap, but helping many other countries escaping the unsustainability trap. What this means actually, UN is experience at the moment in a very difficult way. I think one of our most important agendas is the post-15 discourse, where we are trying in a nutshell to glue together the Millennium Development Goal or their continuation and the Sustainability Development Goals. It is an interesting but terribly difficult debate, and how difficult it is we see, for example, just in front of our doorstep with the so-called Energiewende. I think we can blame the Große Koalition with not having a sufficiently well-developed cooperation and policy. I don't think this is really the reason. The reason is that it is just very difficult to get even our energy supply onto a sustainable basis. So the future of development research, I think, is very much a discussion on the self-understanding of development research itself. In this connection, I'm extremely happy about new research proposals that we are happy to be part of, which has been driven, I think, in your first working weeks, Christian. It is called One Health. Maybe you will talk about it, so I will not go into the details. I just want to say that it includes 4 research areas in Brazil, in Ghana, in India, if I'm remembering correct, and this is why I'm mentioning it, in Germany. This, I think, I really hope that this research proposal will make its way, because I think it is kind of incorporating this new approach, not just thinking about the development being something about the developing countries, but including ourselves, since I think food and nutrition cycles, which are part of this research project, are not independent in these 4 regions. So One Health is an opportunity for cooperation, but it's just one of many, and many others are waiting, and some are running. A very good one being the project Wascal. Don't go into the details here. It's known to many of you. Another sign of our good cooperation is the fact it has already been mentioned by Joachim von Braun. I'm regularly taking part in the directorate's meeting. So we are not just living across the street, we are also behaving like we are living across the street. Dear Christian, I think you have made a good choice for the place for continuing your work. It is ZEF, it is the Science City of Bonn, it is the ministries we happen to have here, it is the NGOs we have here, and then of course it is also UN and UNU which are here. We're glad from UNU-EHS that you made this choice. We're very happy to have you here, and we wish you all the best, you and your family. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Rhyner. Yes, you made a good choice, Christian, but you were also chosen in a highly competitive, tough process, chaired and welcomed by Professor Bartels. He was chair of the search committee, and there are several other members here. These types of processes at our stage or your stage of career sort of get on people's nerves doing the driver's license again is sort of crossing one's mind, but you did that very well. Last not least, I would like to ask our board chair, Hans van Ginkel, to address you and the audience. Hans is, besides being the ZEF board chair, used to be the rector of one of the Netherlands' finest universities in Utrecht, and UN Undersecretary General and rector of the United Nations University based in Tokyo. Hans, please.
Thank you very much, Joachim. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure to see that many of you thought this is an occasion important enough, Christian, to come to. So I think you should be flattered by the audience. And I'm particularly happy to be here because I was sitting next to Dr. Speyer. And so when I started at UNU, and I had been asked by the government of North Rhine-Westphalia to see whether there would be an opportunity to have an establishment of UNU in Bonn, that then Dr. Speyer was there, and together we did work out the different possibilities. So it's quite appropriate that Jakob Rhyner is sitting next to me, because he is the ultimate consequence of what we have been preparing then. But I'm not here in this capacity that's mentioned there. I'm here as the chair of the board. And I was very happy. I remember the many days that we had been sitting here with Professor Bartels and Dr. Kramer and Professor Kremers and the other members to think how we could solve this difficult puzzle to find the success of a ZEF-C, and what could be the qualifications of such a person. So we are very happy to be here now, Christian, to welcome you here. So not only welcome to all of you, but in particular to you, because otherwise there would not be an occasion to be here. And I would like to congratulate you for having been appointed. But I would also like to congratulate ZEF for having a new director of ZEF-C of this level. And I would like to congratulate Bonn as a science city and a UN city for having again a new person coming who can really contribute to the international networking of Bonn. There are many different institutes here now, and I think they can only be strong by working together. So for that you need to have the context, the relations, you have to have the personal skills, the capabilities, the desire to contribute to such cooperation. And that's, I think, very important. And I believe that you have the capabilities, and I will not go into all these things that you have been doing. I got a list of what you have been doing. Well, that was for the committee to look at. You have your experience in tropical agriculture, you were in Benin, you were in Nairobi, you know Germany and the German universities. I think you have the qualifications to have the right context and the right activities and the right programs. And that is important, because ZEF, international cooperation, development research, has new challenges to cope with. I will just summarize them as three. One is how to go from the MDGs to the SDGs, from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. How to identify them. But to identify is only one thing. How to address them. And that is where the institutes in Bonn can contribute. That is the important topic. How to identify them, at the end of the day, New York will take a decision. Whoever is gathered there will take a decision. You may contribute to this type of decision making by giving ideas. You never know what will come out. But after that, to address that, that's your concern. There's a second major point to take into account. And that we are living in a new world. The world today is not the world that was there at the time of the establishment of ZEF. This world has changed. There is globalization. There is, of course, the knowledge society that comes more and more everywhere. There is the increased importance of ethics and values, not just because of the new challenges, because of new frontiers in research which contribute to different ethical choices, but also because we meet people all around the world as a consequence of globalization. And so we have to work together one way or the other. And there is global change, which is much broader than climate change. Climate change is a trap in my view, because people can spend all their time to see whether there is climate change, yes or not. But there will still be soil erosion, there will be natural resources depleted, there will be air that you still have to breathe and that should be healthy to breathe, and so on. There are many different issues in global change to be addressed, which go beyond climate change, and we should not get trapped by all the time start a discussion whether it's yes or not there, but what are the real problems for society, for humankind to survive. That's the issue. And there is the overall shift of what has to be paid by public means and by private means, because the priorities are changing and the overall expenditures are kind of increasing. So we have to think about the shift and to think about the fact that the large extent to which public means were available in our type of countries for development will not be available in developing countries for development, because there is no taxation base nearly as big to do that. So there is a lot of challenges we have to take into account when we address our problems. And there is a third element, and that is knowledge is spreading everywhere. We cannot just behave like we have the knowledge and we are going to bring the knowledge there. No, over there they know a lot also. There are well-educated people in developing countries as well. So our attitudes have to change, the way in which we work. In fact, Pascal is a perfect example. And so I'm happy that Dr. Sadogo is here with us. No, there is a good effort to develop PhD education in West African countries. So it's there. So how can ZEF stay abreast, ahead of all these changes? Be the top of the pyramid, be the preferred partner for them to cooperate, and not just ZEF, the institutes in Bonn cooperating in developing countries. When you look at all this, then you see that with the changes in the new world, we will have to accept that development is not anymore just about agriculture. The overall global trend is that the more successful we are in agriculture, we need less people to work in agriculture. And at the same time, the population is increasing. So the percentage of the labor force working outside agriculture is increasing. And more people are living in cities. So we have to start to think not about the development of rural areas, we have to think about the integrated planning of the rural and the urban together. How to bring employment in the rural areas and food in the cities. And at the same time, with the population increase, this is an additional challenge. And there it's important to think about the fact that when these urban masses are not producing their own food anymore, how to make sure the food is there and secure, is safe. So food security and the loss of food in the logistical chain to bring the food from the land to the people. And the relation between agriculture and health. And there, Christian, that's where you are working, in your interest that you have had over the years for agriculture, human beings, people, and ecology. So, please, Christian, the floor is yours as far as I'm concerned. Thank you very much.
you very much for these kind words. Pro-Rector Professor Kremers, Dean Professor Stehle, Vice-Rector Jakob Rhyner, ZEF Board Chair Professor van Ginkel, Joachim von Braun, thank you very much for these kind words. Fellow Director Solveig Gerke, Dr. Laurent Sedogo, Dr. Boubacar Barry from Wascal, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. This I learned in Kenya. Let me go. It's a great pleasure being with you, and yeah, it's a great pleasure having the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I call little enemies and unhealthy outcomes. I want to give you a little outline of what I want to talk about. I'll start with a couple of slides on say the theoretical background or the framework of my talk, and then I want to focus on 3 case studies. Professor van Ginkel already mentioned my interest in this nexus between agriculture and human health, and this is in a way reflected here in the choice of these 3 case studies. I want to talk a little bit about agriculture, about malaria and climate change, about the Nipah virus outbreak in Malaysia in the late 1990s, a bit about coffee and the future of coffee in East Africa, and then finish this with some 3 concluding remarks or take-home messages. Professor van Ginkel already mentioned global environmental change. I don't think that I need to delve into this more, that global environmental change and as part of this climate change is reality. However, up to relatively recently, policymakers, the general public, and to a certain extent also the scientific community was very much focused on, let's call it more the macro effects of this. I'm thinking about extreme weather events, flooding, disappearance of major, if you want, symbol species like the polar bear. Yet there is an increasing awareness that GECs have a pretty complex nature, and this complexity of global environmental change very often prevents a proper quantification of the outcomes. Now, Myers and Patz developed this theory of insulating layers that very often prevent the measurability of effects of climate change and changes in land use cover through their effects on deterioration of ecosystem services on health outcomes. I would like to zoom a little bit more on this. There are several layers, if you want, several levels of these insulating layers. Let's start with simply the population not yet approaching a vulnerability threshold when it comes to resource constraints. Another level would be that populations actually have the ability, if you want, to pay themselves out of their constraints. Take the example of a water-constrained country or society like Israel that massively imports water through grain. Now, Israel is in the position, economically speaking, to do so. A similarly water-constrained country like Yemen is not. Populations are protected from environmental change through infrastructure or technology as another insulating level. Think about the loss of wetlands, the loss of water filtration, that communities that live downstream then can pay their way off through installation of water filtration systems. Change of behavior and learning, cultural changes that lead communities to be less susceptible to global environmental change outcomes. I'm thinking about using protective clothing in the face of emerging infectious diseases, This will reduce the vulnerability, or at least will shelter communities from the outcomes of global environmental change. And last but not least, philanthropy. Having lived in Africa for the last close to 10 years, I know how much philanthropy has an effect, especially when it comes to provision of medical services, free drugs, insecticide-treated bed nets, societies that can afford indoor residual spraying. All these elements provide insulating layers that make the measuring of negative health outcomes that are fueled by global environmental change and changes in land use very difficult. The rule of thumb, though, is the more vulnerable a population is, the less insulating layers they have, and the more severe the GEC outcome will be. I mentioned complexity. There is another element to think about, that the complexity is actually more pronounced when it comes to networks of biotic interactions. And biotic interactions could be predation, parasitism, disease transmission. This complexity, or the outcomes, are more than you look at an individual organism, like a crop plant. And what you see here, this pretty confusing diagram, comes from a meta-analysis that Tuliakis et al. Conducted using 688 individual studies that looked at the outcome of 5 different GEC drivers, be it CO2 enrichment and deposition, climate change, biotic invasion, and land use change. And they were looking at the effects of trophic webs, of the effects of these 5 GEC drivers on trophic webs. And trophic webs could be plant-plant interactions, plant-herbivore, plant-pathogen, herbivore-pathogen, plant-animal, as well as animal-animal, and above-ground and below-ground interactions. And what they clearly came up with is that you have a cascading effect of changes on higher trophic levels down to lower trophic levels. And in other words, what we should be really concerned about are the impacts of GEC on the higher trophic levels and their effect down on the lower. As the proverb says, there is no enemy little. So let me start with my first case study of malaria and climate change. The resurgence of infectious diseases is probably among the most hotly debated and widely discussed GEC outcomes. And malaria here has a very prominent role because it's, in terms of mortality, clearly the most important infectious disease. We have about 1.5 million, latest estimates about 1.5 million deaths annually, and primarily children under 5 and pregnant women, and primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, IPCC is forecasting a significant longitudinal and altitudinal expansion of emerging infectious diseases, and in particular malaria. And one case in time, or one study that has been widely discussed, were the outbreaks of malaria in the highlands of East Africa in the late 1990s. And this spurred a very controversial debate about the causes for these unprecedented outbreaks. I should maybe say a couple of explaining words for the ones that are not really experts on malaria. Malaria is a child killer. And if you grow up in a malaria holoendemic region as a child, you certainly will get exposed to malaria multiple times during your infancy. Now, you survive, you will build up a certain level of, if you want, acquired, not resistance, but acquired tolerance. So if you get infected later in your life, usually malaria events are less mortal. And I'm talking primarily here about falciparum malaria. However, if malaria reaches new regions, and the case here is the highlands of East Africa, where malaria was not present before. By definition, the population didn't grow up under an environment of disease pressure. And that's why you have in such new outbreak regions very high mortalities in very unusual demographic groups. We're talking about adults. Under normal circumstances, say in a holoendemic region, adult mortality as a result of a malaria infection is usually restricted to people with a deprived immune system, very often HIV infected people and other people that suffer. Having said so, one of the cases that was debated most is related to this very beautiful area in western Kenya. This is the Brook Bonds tea plantation in Kericho. Joachim knows this region very well. It's one of the most spectacularly beautiful parts of Kenya. And Kericho gold is a delicious tea. My wife is addicted to it. Since we lived in Kenya, she's virtually traveling nowhere without a supply of Kericho gold. Now, it's not the only delicious tea that they're producing in Kericho. I think it's probably the continent's biggest tea plantation. About 50,000 people live there. And it's a very old plantation. I think it dates back to the early 1920s. And the owners of Brook Bonds, the owners of the Kericho tea plantation, have kept meticulous records, basically since the beginning of the operations there, when it comes to health stats of their employees, as well as the meteorological data. So this plantation offers a treasure chest in time and space when it comes to meteorological data, as well as when it comes to health data. Now, Shanks et al. In a paper in Emerging Infectious Disease 2002 used this data set from the Kericho tea plantation, from 96 to 95, and analyzed the relationships between malaria incidence and hospital admission and temperature and rainfall, and couldn't find any relationship. This was part of the ongoing Malaria Atlas project. Now, more recently, Pasquale revisited this case, looked at a different data set using temperature from the Climate Research Unit in Norwich, and using a larger data set dating from 1950 to 2002, and looked at the relationships of temperature in Kericho, as well as in Kubale in Uganda, and two places in Rwanda and Burundi. And they could link significant increases in temperature over time with an increase in malaria incidence. So where does this leave us? Now, Shanks et al. Attribute the undisputed spur in mortality due to malaria during this period in the 1990s, primarily to the breakdown of chloroquine. Chloroquine at that time was an incredibly effective drug against falciparum malaria, and we lost this drug in the 1990s. Widespread resistance in falciparum populations, including in East Africa, became very common, and the drug is no longer useful. So Shanks attribute this outbreak of malaria in the highlands not so much to temperature factors, but to a breakdown of chloroquine, whereas Pasquale does not rule out, Pasquale et al. Does not rule out that temperature-driven factors that affect the development both of the vector population as well as the pathogen played a role in these epidemics. Now, more recently, again, people from Gething et al. From the Malaria Atlas project did a remarkable study analyzing 100 years of data of falciparum. Again, for the ones that are not too familiar with malaria, Plasmodium falciparum is the lethal malaria pathogen, the ones that, well, causes a lot of death. Gething et al. We're looking at 100 years of falciparum data by comparing the situation of malaria, endemicity of malaria at the turn of the last century, around 1900, with the situation in 2007, and computed the difference. Now, you have to keep in mind that during the last 100 years, we saw an unprecedented rise in temperature. So these changes happened in a significantly warming global environment. Now, what did they find? They found a significant disappearance of malaria from many, falciparum malaria, from many regions in the world. Just look at South America, Brazil in particular, look at Central Asia, and look at East Africa, and Southeast Asia. And the figures that you see here, the color coding is the more change, the more loss of malaria, the darker blue the color. So what we actually see what we have seen over the last 100 years is a dramatic reduction in the endemicity of malaria across the globe, despite the fact that our globe has warmed significantly. Now, Gething attributes this, among others, to much greater efforts when it comes to control of the disease and control of the vectors. They attribute it to environmental management. They attribute it to basically the development of economies, the development of many economies. And they think that these factors were much more important and actually overruled, in a way, the temperature factors, the undisputed, again, factors of rising temperatures on certain biological parameters of the vector as well as the pathogen. And finally, these authors conclude that the success or failure of our efforts, our global efforts to control, maybe even to eradicate falciparum malaria, will be substantially more affected by control efforts than by climate change. Now, this has, in a way, a caveat. If we look at the reasons for the successes we have achieved in falciparum malaria control over the last 15 years, you can reduce them basically to two elements. First and foremost is artemisinin-based co-therapy. Highly efficient anti-malarial drugs that are nowadays freely available, or at least to highly subsidized rates as first-line defense drugs. And second, the availability of synthetic pyrethroids, especially deltamethrin and permethrin, as part of indoor residual spraying, and especially as the treatment for long-lasting insecticide-treated nets, so IRS and LLINs. These are the two columns on which present very efficient anti-malaria campaigns, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, rely. Now, we are in a situation where we're about to lose these two vital and essential elements of our anti-malaria campaigns. First and foremost, there are increasing reports about treatment failure with artemisinin-based drugs coming from the Golden Triangle area of Southeast Asia, and that's the hotbed of drug resistance development in falciparum malaria. Chloroquine resistance developed there, and usually it takes about 4 to 5 years until these resistant strains end up in Africa. So usually from a record of a breakdown of an anti-malaria drug in Southeast Asia to treatment failure in Africa, it's a period of 4 or 5 years. So this is already a threat that we might lose artemisinin as our first-line drug, first-line defense drug. And there's nothing on the horizon that would replace artemisinin-based co-therapy quickly. The second threat is pyrethroid resistance. Pyrethroids have been around for about 50 years, and there's increasing levels of pyrethroid resistance in Anopheles populations, Anopheles being the prime vectors of falciparum malaria in tropical Africa. And again, there is no other insecticide that we could switch to. There are no insecticides, public health suitable insecticides on the horizon that might replace pyrethroids. And there's another threat that comes on top, and that's where we, and my colleagues, worked on. We looked at the population composition in various cities around the Kenyan coast over the last 20 years. The prime vector of malaria in sub-Saharan Africa is Anopheles gambiae. And Anopheles gambiae is a bit complicated, it's a species complex. Anopheles gambiae SS, sensu stricto, is the prime vector of malaria in tropical Africa. And all the control efforts that I've mentioned, indoor residual spraying and insecticide-treated nets, focus on malaria that is transmitted within the dwellings, indoors. And that's where Gambiae SS feeds. What we observed is that over the last 20 years, there's been a dramatic decline in Gambiae SS, the home-dwelling mosquitoes, and a dramatic increase of Arabiensis and Merus, which are outdoor-biting mosquitoes. So you have to think that presently, the prime vectors of malaria attack you, say, post 11 p.m., and it attacks you in your bedroom. If you're under an insecticide-treated net and your walls have been treated with a long-lasting pyrethroid, you're pretty safe. Now, if you do this over 20 years, the ones that accompany you in your bedroom get hammered, and they disappear, and that's what we are observing. So the prime vector that used to bother you in your bedroom has disappeared. And another group is taking over that bites you during the course of the day while you're in the field. Sounds trivial, but the problem is we have no control strategies at hand that would deal with the mosquitoes that will bite you once you leave your house. So there is a fair chance that in future, people in the tropics, in tropical Africa, will see malaria outdoors during the course of the day. And this is a real threat to the present control strategies and threatens the current levels of success in terms of reducing malaria. Let me come to the second case study. This is on Nipah virus and the environment. Nipah virus is a paramyxis virus which causes acute respiratory syndromes and especially fatal encephalitis in humans as well as in some domestic animals, in particular pigs. Now, there was a very spectacular outbreak for the first time of this disease in Malaysia in the late 1990s, causing about 250 cases of human encephalitis, as well as led to a phenomenally big culling of pigs. Now, NIF is maintained by these incredibly beautiful fruit bats of the genus Pteropus. Very often they are referred to as flying foxes. And the transmission is through saliva, urine, feces of these bats, as well as through discarded fruits. Now, the distribution range of Nipah virus is largely defined by the distribution range of these flying foxes. Coming back to and in more recent outbreaks, following the first one in Malaysia, in Bangladesh and in India, actually no intermediate host, meaning no pigs, as in the case of Malaysia, were involved. So it seems that humans picked up the virus directly from contaminated food, I think probably dates, and some people even speculate about the possibility of human to human, also direct transmission of this virus, making it a potentially incredibly dangerous zoonotic disease. Now, the 1997 outbreak in Malaysia was accompanied by a very, if you want, very spectacular hypothesis. This coincided with a very significant ENSO-driven drought, which then resulted in large-scale forest fires, particularly on Sumatra and Borneo. And the theory was, the hypothesis was that the haze that was created by these fires led to, if you want, a mass emigration of flying foxes populations, especially from Sumatra over the Strait of Malacca into Malaysia, and that's how the virus, that's how the Nipah virus was introduced into Malaysia. Now, you can imagine that such a hypothesis gained a lot of public interest. Now, more recently, Pulliam et al. in a Royal Society interface paper did a meticulous detective-like story and reanalyzing, revisiting this outbreak, and came up with, if you want, a far more mundane explanation. First and foremost, with serological and modeling efforts, they could clearly prove that the virus was already in flying foxes populations in Malaysia, predating the Nipah outbreak of 1997. In addition, their evidence was suggesting that actually agricultural intensification in Malaysia in the 70s, 80s, and 90s led to an increased encroachment of agricultural productivity zones into forest areas, which then resulted in more bat-pig and bat-pig human contacts, and which led to a repeated priming of pig populations with the Nipah virus. And what they found out was the most important explanatory variable for this outbreak was simply the proximity of mango trees to piggeries. The proximity of mango trees to piggeries, and very simple public health or policy regulations which enforced buffer zones when it came to mango production and pig production, completely eliminated the problem of Nipah from Malaysia as we speak. Let me come to the last example, or the last case study, coffee. And in particular here, the future of coffee in East Africa. The coffee lovers will be happy to learn that it's actually the most valuable agricultural commodity we know. It's about 90 billion US a year. I think it's only beaten by petrol. Petroleum has a higher value overall. Now, the coffee berry borer, this tiny little cucullinate here, is the biggest constraint, the biggest biotic constraint for coffee production worldwide. It's more or less has reached all coffee production zones in the world and causes losses to the tune of approximately $500 million US a year. In a study that we published in 2009, we first modeled the thermal tolerance of CBB and came up with a model which forecasted a significant increase of generations of CBB with a temperature increase of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, and altitudinal as well as latitudinal shifts in the distribution of the pest once the temperature increases beyond 2 degrees, as you can see here, latitudinal as well as altitudinal. So simply put, you have to move up your plantations the hill. Now, we used this biological model and took it together with climate data in order to develop predictions for East Africa's coffee production in 2050. And we had, if you want, 3 major findings. First of all, this prediction indicated that Arabica, which is the more valuable highland type of coffee, would disappear from any production zones that are below 1,200 meters in altitude. The present prime production zones of 1,300 to 1,800 meters of altitude in East Africa would face serious coffee berry borer outbreaks and would lead to an enormous constrained production in this area. And in order to be safe, Arabica would need to be moved, Arabica plantations would need to be moved beyond 1,800 meters in altitude. And we also looked at the availability of growing areas of 1,800 meters and above in East Africa, and they're not that many. So, grosso modo, we forecasted that under a climate change 2050 environment, we would see a significant reduction, temperature-driven and CBB pest-driven reduction of coffee production in East Africa, and even more so for the lowland coffee, Robusta. Now, from this, if you want, mapping exercise, we zoomed in. We wanted to look at one particular production zone, and if you want, similar as the Kericho tea plantation exercise or story that I told you before. Here we looked at the production around Kiambu in the central province of Kenya, which is one of the oldest coffee production zones in Kenya, where coffee production goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. And what we found out by comparing, let me go one step back. One thing that made this zone, again, the parallel is with the Kericho tea plantation. What made this zone so very special is we had access to meteorological data from the turn of the 19th to the 20th century up to now. Now, anybody who has worked in Africa knows how, and I'm talking about very precise meteorological data, continuous meteorological data. Anybody who has worked in Africa knows how rare it is to find such very long-lasting, precise data sets on temperature and on meteorological factors. So what did we observe? First of all, a dramatic change in demography. If you just look at the changes from 1969 to 2011, population in Kiambu increased from 196 to 638 people per square kilometer. Kiambu, which used to be a rural district in the central province of Kenya, has basically been swallowed by Nairobi. It's part of the greater Nairobi area nowadays. Now, this went ahead, as you would expect, with dramatic land use changes over the last 30, 40 years. And these land use changes led to a significant loss in biomass. And last but not least, looking at the temperature data, we observe a 0.05 degrees Celsius annual increase in temperature in Kiambu, or roughly 4 degrees Celsius from 29 to 2007. And all these factors evidently are very much intertwined and substantially influence the coffee production in this area. Now, if you want, there was one very interesting environmental footnote, or coming back to Putz-Myers, an insulating layer. Because what we observed is that the production types that were really hammered by these changes were not so much the small plantations, but the big ones, where coffee is grown as a huge monocrop without shade trees. Whereas more coffee gardens, as you see here, were much less affected. And this is probably due to the fact that when coffee is grown under shade trees, the microclimatic conditions in the plantations are pretty much different. Simply the temperature drops, the plantations are cooler. So, coming to the end of my talk, what are my take-home messages? There are three. First of all, I hope you've seen that these cascading effects of the actually not so little enemies of higher trophic levels have probably the greatest potential to cause harm as a result of global environmental change. I think that simplistically temperature-only driven models often fail to capture these GEC outcomes. Other factors can entirely change the picture, both positively as well as negatively, and adding a significant element of complexity to the picture. And I think if you want to capture this complexity, interdisciplinarity is a prerequisite, and I hope that these three case studies have illustrated that you cannot achieve this without an interdisciplinary approach. And last but not least, acknowledgements to my colleagues at ICIPE, colleagues from the Kenya Meteorological Department. The coffee study was funded by the German Research Foundation. We did a lot of research on the Mbumi coffee millers plantation. Leibniz University of Hanover was a trusted partner in the coffee research. Kenya Medical Research Institute colleagues participated in the malaria studies that were funded by a foundation from Switzerland, and we collaborated with colleagues in the US, the universities of Miami and Illinois. And with this, I would like to thank you very much.
Well, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I think I express also your sentiments that we're truly grateful for this exciting talk and further raising our expectations what you are up to, Christian, in the next few years and decades. Thank you very much. I'm sure you all want to debate him now and ask him questions and so on. You're welcome to do so outside during the reception. Thank you very much for coming and for paying closely attention. I think we all were very captivated by your talk, Christian, and thanks again. Please move on.